everyone, and welcome to today's ASEN seminar, where we are talking about a recent themed section from Nations and Nationalism on mechanisms of national solidarity. And we have an all-star cast today: Danny Kaplan, Siniša Malešević, Lea David, Lainer-Vos, John Fox, and Hizky Shoham. I'm not going to do introductions if you don't mind, because there's 6 of you, and it would take a while. Needless to say, you're all fabulous and all looking wonderful. So thank you for joining us. Just to a quick announcement at the start: our next event is going to be on the 18th of February with this year's Anthony D. Smith Visiting Fellow, which ASEN sponsors at LSE Ideas, who this year is Timo Arva, and he will be speaking on non-territorial autonomy in the Baltic states in the first part of the 20th century. More information on our website. As ever, we are broadcasting live on Zoom, Facebook and YouTube. Whichever platform you're on, if you've got a question, do please ask it wherever you are, and I will pass them to the hosts. I think that's quite enough from me. So without further ado, I will hand over to Danny Kaplan, who is going to introduce everything, and then give some remarks on his article. Danny, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Hello, everybody. David, thank you very much for arranging this event, and thanks to all the contributors and this theme section. This project is the result of an international workshop on national solidarity initiated by the Bar-Ilan Center for Cultural Sociology, and the workshop hosted by the Ben-Gurion Institute in Stable Care. And we met with a couple of other people back in May 2022. And here we are, like 3 years or more, and we have some of those articles out there. So thank you all for that. I'll now try to share my presentation. My timely presentation with the American flag. Let's see that you can see it. Okay, is it on now, right? Everybody can see the presentation. So I'll talk 2 minutes, I think, on the introduction and the rationale for this project, and then I'll move on to my own work. We really set out to explore the best ways to study national solidarity as something separate from national identity. And that's really the starting point for this, because the concept of national identity has been researched far more. Identity basically refers, just a second, I'm trying to move on the presentation, sorry. Identity refers to group commonalities, customs, symbolic representations of values, collective memory, whereas solidarity is more about doing the nation. So identity is more like being the nation, but solidarity is more like about doing the nation. It's the glue that binds strangers through practices of cooperation, trust, sociability, and willingness to take collective action. And again, the research on solidarity is surprisingly scarce within studies of nationhood. And also we should make a differentiation between bounded solidarity, which is what most people think about within national solidarity, versus redistributive solidarity, which is more about dealing with inequalities. We're talking more about bounded solidarity in our project today. I won't talk about this nice graph, but the idea is that nationness is always, national belonging is always about identity and about solidarity. And that's part of the challenge here, to kind of single out and distinguish between the two. That's the main challenge. And the second challenge is what we thought about, that we want to focus on the mechanisms. So the idea is that we're looking at mechanisms of solidarity, by which I mean different configurations of interpersonal interactions, networks, communicative processes, social political institutions, and iconic objects. And you'll hear about all of this today, about those different kinds of mechanisms or elements of mechanisms. And of course, it happens through rituals, customs, regulations, media, public discourse, and obviously behind all of that is ideology. And we are going to look today at sporting events, And this is also the order of our talks today: sporting events, military friendships, protests and commemoration, diaspora ethnic networks, COVID-19 pandemic, and last but not least, culinary nationalism. This is basically our 6 general topics today. And the distinctions we're going to make are basically, we can think of it in terms of binary distinctions between grassroots versus elite or state actors, banal versus ecstatic nationalism, and going back to classic mechanical versus organic solidarity. We'll hear about that by Hizky. So if you stick to the very end, you'll see some interesting things that can still be said about, surprisingly, can still be said about Durkheim's distinction between mechanical and organic solidarity. And moving straight ahead to my own presentation, which is really now the first paper, I am picking up on what we just saw and focusing on a distinction that we want to make in this paper between clubs and events. And I look at them as 2 models of performance. And I'm going to focus about sports. I'm not going to talk about the United States, but this is kind of a timely flag for today. So basically, I make a distinction here between what I call a performer audience model, and I'll explain that, versus a social network model, 2 different models of performance in any context, but also in context of sports and nationalism. And again, connecting it with this question of how we distinguish between solidarity and identity. I'm going to talk about 2 case studies, which are not mine. This is kind of a meta reading of studies, and these are 2 different kind of studies. The first is watching the 2012 Euro Cup, and again I connected with what I call a performer audience model. It's a study from 2017 by von Schaef, Mozolowska, and Ismer, who dealt with nationalism and sports. And I'm going to run very quickly through their study. Of course, I'm going to do just to get an idea about it. It's a quantitative survey of viewers' attitudes, and they took on viewers from Germany, Britain, and Poland. Poland hosted that event that year. And the basic finding is that collective effervescence, and we're going to follow up by Durkheim's and Collin's idea of collective effervescence. So collective effervescence when viewing the game boosts viewers' national identification, including their feelings of solidarity. So just the idea that I refer to as performer audience model is really Durkheim's classic idea of public event that includes a shared focused attention of the audience to what's going on the stage or in the stadium. Viewers experience collective effervescence, emotional energy, feelings of togetherness. These emotions project onto the group symbols, such as the flags of the countries, etc. And this effervescence affects national identification, including solidarity, and may transcend beyond the event, so it can go on to everyday life. This is something mentioned by Durkheim and was taken up by Collins, who actually developed that idea, and he talked about time bubbles, meaning that there is a particular time limit that feelings of solidarity can move on from the event to everyday life, but then this will not last more than 2, 3, 4 weeks, depending on the context. So all of this can also be connected with this kind of event, like a big mega event of watching the Euro Cup. And what I want to make notice of is that there is a causal pathway here, which is a kind of subtle, it's not really said as such, but it's that solidarity is simply a byproduct. So solidarity here somehow develops with this feelings of emotions, but it's really measured in this study as part of it, as a collective identity, not as a separate thing. So solidarity develops as a product of the identity that is reinforced by watching the games. And then this identity is reaffirmed through collective effervescence. But solidarity itself is pretty minor in this idea, in this concept, in this idea of public event or performer audience model. And I want to compare this to my next case study, which again, I have to run through it, about psychic clubs in France. This is an historical study, so I'm kind of comparing here apples and oranges, but at least both of them are sports, okay? And the idea here that I was looking for a study, and there's of course many of them that do a kind of historic or ethnographic, in this case historic work, on clubs, on club sociability, on how people in sports clubs, in this case, develop solidarity, basically. So this is a study by Baker, a historian of early 20th century France. And looking at my concept of club sociability, we're looking at basically on friendship ties. So these are friendship ties around common interests like cycling. And there's criteria for membership. Of course, not everybody can join the club. And then what's happening in clubs, in any kind of club, is expressive sociability, which means more humor and shared coded language. And all of that contributes to a sense of intimacy, which I call public intimacy. And this is actually the mechanism I'm focusing on in my own work. And I really try very briefly to explain it right here, that we're talking about a performance, not just of actors on stage or actors as in themselves. We're talking about a performance of a relationship. What is performed is actually the relationship between the actors or the friendship. Okay, like two guys going to a club and they say, let's be awesome in public. So this is what I call public intimacy. And the idea is that two or more actors display their exclusiveness, display their special codes, display their special secrets in front of the public or just the general audience. And this may develop solidarity, and I'll try to explain how. Going back to the actual case study, we're talking about how group sociability developed within those clubs, within those cycling clubs. And they would meet in local centers, in bars, and in places where they can gather and make formal and social gatherings, like informal gatherings just for food and drinks. That's the main sociability that happens in clubs. Of course, in this particular kind of club, there's also the competitions, sports competitions. Competition is a major issue in sports. We'll hear about it more with Don Lainer-Vos talk about different kinds of sports. And then it's also this idea of public intimacy, because those people run with their clubs at the local setting. They go on at the bus to the regional and national competitions. So there's different kinds of opportunities for them to present their relationship for different kinds of audiences, sports audiences and the general audience. And this is technically an instance of public intimacy, which moves the issue from the level of friendship, of local friendships or personal friendships, to the level of a wider audience. And the best way to illustrate that
sorry to cut across you, Danny. We're sort of tight on time. If you
Okay.
can.
Okay, I have I'm really at the end. So public events, again, I'm going back to the idea of public events. The best example of public events that has to do with France and cycling is, of course, the Tour de France. So looking at this in the general context of local cycling club, and then moving on to how the history of Tour de France has developed, and I won't go into that right now, shows us this kind of general connection between micro-level friendships and macro-level collective performances, which together make this idea of solidarity more coming from bottom up. And so the causal pathway here is from sociability to collective solidarity, which is more like emergent in this kind of framework, and then to the spread of a national identity, as in the case of Tour de France, which of course has become one of the main core of national identity in France. This nice table I won't go into. It really summarizes the whole frameworks. But just to sum up, I'm trying to show how solidarity can be more emergent, as an emergent phenomena, once you look at it from the perspective of clubs, and less so when you look at it from the perspective of Durkheim's public events. And so the idea of networks and friendships is something that I think we should more look into to make sense of mechanisms of solidarity. So let's stop here, and we can move on to the next speaker, which is Siniša, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so I'll close down this presentation. Yep.
Yes. So, sorry. Where is it? Just need to find that. Where did this document? Screen document. Oh, something is wrong with my slides. I cannot find them.
It's the endless joy of computers.
Yeah,
everything works fine when you're testing, and then
it was there when we tested it. I
Yeah.
don't know what's happened now. I cannot find it now. We just open it somewhere else. Sorry.
While you're finding that, Siniša, I was reading saying about emergent phenomena. Solidarity is an emergent phenomenon. I was actually, there's a paper that came out, I think, yesterday. I just had a quick read through. Solidarity is a different phenomenon, but in political parties, and particularly political parties of the extremes, just made me immediately sort of made a connection there. I'll have to think up a question. But Siniša, over to you.
Yeah. Thanks very much again. Sorry for my technical illiteracy here. Okay, so thanks again both to Danny and David for organizing this event, and to Danny also for kind of being persistent for over many years. We started this during the COVID and we were interrupted, and eventually we ended up with these papers, which is great to see. So my paper focuses really on a certain paradox that military organizations are generally all over the world defined by their kind of excessive nationalism, a lot of patriotic language and discourses and everything else, while the soldiers on the battlefield tend to be very reluctant to use that kind of language. And they're sometimes hostile to those who bring what they see to be a civilian language in the field on the front line. So what I'm trying to do in a way is to look here at the kind of this relationship between I'm looking at this relationship between kind of solidarities that develop in a micro context of soldiers, kind of these very deep comradeships, and what happens to them before and after the conflict in itself. So how these micro level networks become nationalized, in a sense, how they become transformed into these large scale nationalist narratives that we see that become identified with the military and eventually also with the state. So the paper really is a sort of a dialogue with Ben Anderson's notion of nationalism being a form of deep horizontal comradeship. And what I'm trying to say is really that it's not so easy to develop that kind of comradeship. This is something that requires a lot of organizational, ideological, and micro-interactional work. And we know that from various other studies on with soldiers that there is really this tendency, the further away you are from the actual conflict, you tend to be more attached to the nation and even more aggressive towards the enemy. So that has been studied, obviously, from the Second World War, Vietnam War, and other places. So my focus is really, I've done these interviews with former combatants who fought in wars, 1990 wars in Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina. So I interviewed mostly former soldiers from Croatian army and from Bosnian Serb army, looking at the way looking essentially at their motivations, looking at the way how they understood the nation, how they understood the enemy, how they relate to their own comrades and so on. So what I see here essentially are three different aspects of this phenomenon. One is the way how micro-solidarity developed and motivated combatants to join and fight in these wars. So these are mostly friendships and kinship networks from home. So they often, as you can see in these quotes, they make reference to why they joined. I felt, responsibility towards my mother and father. All my friends joined. My school, everybody from my school went. So I had to. There was a sense of obligation. Often, saying something like we were the same kids of the same generation in the same shit. So this was it wasn't particularly enthusiastic reason for joining, but the key issue here is that micro level links, micro level attachments, solidarity from these small networks, small groups played a crucial role rather than nationalism. Then we find also, I in these interviews, strong attachments to comrades on the battlefield. So this is not unique. This has been the case. It has been studied all over in different wars, how once you find yourself in the situation of life and death, that people develop very strong bonds, strong sense of attachment that is even stronger than they had with their family members. So a lot of my respondents make that sense, these kinds of claims. We felt solidarity towards each other. When somebody was injured, everybody would look after him. I was ready to die for them. They would do the same for me. I was carrying a wounded comrade, and they were shelling at me, and if it hits you, it hits you. They also emphasize how these comradeships are very strong. They continue for years and years after war. They see each other as brothers and meet, after in a more casual environment. So in a sense, these bonds continue, and they're not nationally framed. They very rarely make reference to nationhood. And the third element here, which is also interesting, is that despite these conflicts obviously being very much defined by ethno-national logic, soldiers often emphasize that was not the reason they joined, that they have no sense of hate towards the enemy. They often, emphasize very strongly that they had friends who were from the other side. Like my best friend was a Muslim, or my friends, half of my friends were Muslims and Croats. And even today, when they come from Sweden or Denmark, we are together. I was never a nationalist in that sense. So, what's interesting in all of these reflections, what features prominently is that sense of micro-level attachment, which is defined by friendship, by kinship, by kind of symbolic brotherhood, which is not national. So what I'm trying to do in a paper is to see how this becomes nationalized through these processes that I've analyzed more extensively in my 2019 book, Grounded Nationalism, and the new book that I'm just finishing now. So I look at these three main processes of grounding: the organizational grounding, the ideological grounding, the micro-interactional grounding, and I try to understand how states, how military organizations, how veteran organizations use, kind of these discourses and operate through specific nation-centric institutions that in a way achieve this transition or translation of micro-level attachments into national solidarity. And then I obviously look at ideology, the vehicles, the key ideological vehicles like mass media, educational system, social media more recently, public sphere, how they reproduce these nation-centric categories and frame micro-level attachments, micro-level solidarities into a national solidarity. And finally, I look also at the way how all of these kind of large-scale structures tap into these existing networks of solidarity and frame them, in these very strong ideological terms. So often soldiers themselves go with this. Once the conflict is over, they have this capital, military capital that they can use and veteran organizations and the state expect them to. So they often do that. So they become more nationalist after the conflict rather than during the conflict. So I also look at the way how the state generally social organizations, militaries, veteran organizations try to instrumentalize this in a sense, the way how these micro-level bonds are reconciled. It's not an easy relationship. There is a constant tension here. And basically, just to conclude, I question Ben Anderson's argument that nationalism is a deep form of deep horizontal comradeship. I try to say that this is the deep comradeships require constant work. It's an ongoing work, organizational, ideological, macro-interactional. I'll stop here now, and thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you, Siniša. And we'll hand over to Lea David.
What is this? Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
But what is on your on the screen? What do you see?
At the moment, we see what I think is your title screen: the victim shoes trope and emerging solidarity. And
okay. Excellent. Because I see something else. I don't know. Wait, just maybe. Okay. Wait. Timer. I'm putting the timer. Okay, now something completely different. I'm going to talk about the victim's shoes trope and emerging solidarity in political protests. And it goes slightly with what actually Danny was saying about this phenomena like emergent phenomena of solidarity. Wait. Okay. So yeah. Shoes. I mean, they're all over, they're all around us, but I'm talking about a very particular category of shoes. I'm talking about victim shoes that they have very clear symbolic value, and hence they're widely used in different kinds of protests. So I call these other shoes pave their way because the meaning and the way in which they actually became symbols is very much embedded in the way they were circulated. So long genealogical trajectories, museum displays and image circulations fixated their symbolic meaning of void, loss, and death. In other words, when you see an empty shoe, you immediately think of those notions of void, loss, destruction, and death, and those notions are fixated through their vast circulation. So we are all actually very much knowledgeable about those meanings. Victim shoes provide the organizational frame or the shared ground for solidarity, and in a second I'm going to explain why this organizing frame is very important during the protest times. They are used to forge bonds of national solidarity and to strengthen the boundaries of the moral community of belonging to a nation. But again, we will see not only, and I'm not going to talk about it, but it is not only bounded to national solidarity. Solidarities might be attached to many different agendas. Again, just one sentence about this circulation. Whoever visited any Holocaust museum or genocide museum, victim shoes became the most usual repertoire. Every even genocide museum will not go without having this kind of displays, and that actually resonates with the audiences. Then also, even if you never been to a Holocaust or genocide museum, you certainly watch some movies or saw it in documentaries or books, those big piles of shoes. So this actually image of victim shoe is resonating globally. Now, in my article, I use two main concepts, emotional energy and frames of amplification, to actually talk about the mechanism through which the shoes are ascribed agency for solidarity. First, it is this Goffman's notion of frame construct, and together with Collins' interaction ritual chains, I actually try to define those shoes as fitting the frames as principles of organization which govern the subjective meaning we assign to social events. So in that sense, you put shoes and they become social frame of message amplification. People might not talk in those protests, but they have shoes actually at the focus of this protests, and those shoes are actually bonding like-minded participants. Emotional energy, the feeling of enthusiasm, confidence, motivation that individuals gain as a result of participating in group encounters, when the shared focus of attention and synchronized action amplify the emotional experience. So in that sense, shoes are here very important because it goes beyond this model that people are doing just in interaction within themselves. Here, the actually focus is on those shoes. And this leads to solidarity, this capacity to ideologically and organizationally penetrate people's feelings of attachment and link them into a relatively coherent and potentially recruiting ideological meta-narrative. We can talk about national solidarity, human rights solidarity, etc. So the use of this victim shoes trope is really widespread, and you can find it for many different purposes and agendas, and it can be for the purpose of protesting genocide, gendered violence, unemployment, COVID policies. So I have a very, very large database of those shoes used in different protests. and it is a global phenomena. So what I claim here with my last 40 seconds is that this article expands the notion of interaction ritual chains to human object relations, and it shows that it is encounters between people and object that shape and synchronize the overall emotional energy, and they create those mutual solidarity. So it doesn't have to be just people with people. They have this kind of transition object through which they shape this solidarity. The victim shoe trope, though born in a Second World War and Holocaust, actually only once the interaction ritual chains were initiated by multiple encounters, meaning seeing that in many different contexts, the victim shoes gain agency. It's only when you put those shoes in those protests, they have an agency just because you actually understand their meaning from previous encounters. And they become the focus of attention and emotional energy. So the symbolic nature of the shoes, which sets emotions in play via the participant's strong focus, forms an emergent sense of solidarity rather than the object simply representing a pre-existing solidarity. That was, thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Lea. And we'll go over to Daniel Lainer-Vos.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. Okay, research on nationalism demonstrate that ethnic groups and nations materialize through concrete experiences in specific settings. In these settings, fun plays an essential but under-theorized role. To study fun and nation building, I borrow from Irving Goffman's work on social occasions and examine the formation of an Irish-American Gaelic Athletic League in New York. I focus on the organizers' challenges and the solutions they devised in order to allow immigrants from different counties in Ireland to have fun together and think of themselves as Irish. While known as an observer of everyday interaction, Goffman used the concept of social occasions to explore the organization of interactions. Occasions are events bounded in regard to place and time, and typically facilitated by fixed equipment. A social occasion provides a structuring social context in which many situations and gatherings are likely to form, dissolve, and reform. Occasions come in all shapes and forms, but fun occasions are particularly relevant here. Fine and Court explain that fun is more than simply an enjoyable experience. We do fun together through interactions with others, and as a result, fun serves as a unique commitment device. When participants derive pleasure from participation, they form social bonds and invest in the group's existence. National occasions are bounded events that bring putative members of the nation to socialize with their co-nationals. National occasions play a particularly important role in diasporic settings, where the salience of the ethnic or national category is always in question. In such settings, national occasions serve as some sort of scaffolding that foster interactions and encourage participants to think of themselves as members of an ethnic category. To explore the production of fun national occasions, I trace the creation of a Gaelic Athletic League in New York at the turn of the previous century. The league organizers had clear intentions. They hoped that through the league, men from the north will meet the south, men from the east will meet the west, reminding us of the glorious days of Ireland. Contrary to the belief that immigrants from Ireland were already Irish, they weren't quite Irish. They often identified at the subnational level of their county of origin and also associated at that level. The league organizers hoped to change that. Turning the games into fun occasions, however, proved very difficult. In some instances, especially when teams representing different counties in Ireland were very uneven, matches were boring. They failed to generate enthusiasm or crowds. In other instances, games deteriorated into violent brawls between and fans from different counties in Ireland. Rather than producing joyful camaraderie, games often exacerbated tensions between counties and generated shame, not national pride. Organizers addressed these problems by experimenting over a whole decade with new ways to schedule and regulate games. Eventually, after a decade of struggles and experimentations, the organizers created a league structure wherein teams representing different counties in Ireland and their spectators could play in a spirit of friendly competition, have fun together, and develop a sense of shared belonging. There is a long tradition of research that links sport and nationalism. In this tradition, sport typically serves as some sort of symbolic resource or a reservoir of emotion and excitement that nation builders use more or less instrumentally to promote national identification. While intuitive, this approach rests on two assumptions that I find problematic. First, scholars assume that sport is always exciting and fun, and overlook many instances where sport simply fails to inspire commitment or loyalty. Second, scholars often assume that the boundaries between ethnic groups are given and evident for members. My study joins the research on sport and nationalism, but breaks with these on two important grounds. Rather than assuming that sport is naturally exciting, I follow the shaping of the league and show that creating fun occasions is a delicate organizational accomplishment. Second, following the construction of the league, I can trace the creation of occasions where immigrants from different counties in Ireland could gradually form inter-county ties and develop a sense of shared national belonging. Thank you.
And on the subject of sport not always being exciting, Yeovil Town are playing at home on Saturday. And given how they've been doing so far, I don't think it will be exciting. And I'll hand over to John Fox, if I may. John.
Hi, everyone. Can you see my screen okay? Is that all right?
Yeah, yes, we can see it fine.
Good. All right. Thanks. So good. Have I used all my time up yet, David? I still have some time left. Okay, so this is a talk I want to give. So my paper today is about how local solidarities become national imaginaries in the time of COVID through clapping ceremonies. So basically, starting with something that's local and non-national, so explicitly non-national. In the sense similar to kind of what Siniša was talking about, but then also how that gets scaled up to something that's national, but not a national solidarity. So I really lower the bar significantly here. Sorry, Danny, to the kind of national imaginary idea, which I'll talk about in a moment. So Danny asked us to focus on mechanisms of solidarity in the short talk. So that's what I'm going to do. And I'm going to do it like this by starting with this idea of local solidarities, how those take shape during the time of COVID, and then move on to how a kind of national imaginary emerges subtly through the symbols on display in these clapping ceremonies, the ritual chains like Lea was talking about, but in a somewhat different context. So it's not shoes now, it's people or clapping ceremonies. And then finally onto the organizational capacity of states, borrowing that from Siniša. So kind of mix and match here. So starting with local solidarities, clapping in England, like in many parts of the world, there's happened in many, many different countries. It was an important ritual practice for performing local solidarities, giving clappers a kind of local, tangible experience of community. Clapping, though, I argued, isn't the thing that generates the solidarity. Rather, the solidarity was generated in our data, at least, through people helping each other and talking about a kind of a community spirit taking shape when they were helping each other. Clapping is important because it takes a kind of private acts of helping each other and gives it a platform, a public platform for the performance and the expression of solidarities that were shaped elsewhere. These were hyper-local neighborhood and street affairs that had nothing to do with the nation, never appears in our data anywhere. So it's a bit kind of hidden, which is why I talk about the hidden nation here. So what teases it out? How does it become? How do we get from the tangible experience of local solidarities to banal imaginaries of the nation? Well, through three mechanisms, the way I want to talk about here. Symbols, ritual chains, and the organizational capacity of states. So I'll start with, I'll say something briefly about each of these. First of all, symbols on display. So they form the backdrop for clapping ceremonies, and they remind clappers in a very subtle and indirect and implicit way that they're somehow clapping for a nation. Now, this isn't a kind of ceremony that had loads of national flags or any, I mean, if you search them up on Google Images, you can find one or two or something, but that's not the defining symbol of these events. The symbols that were on display were much subtler. They were things like homemade NHS logos, so the National Health Service, copycat rainbows. These became very popular in England with handwritten text referencing the NHS again. And then just the color blue. This is the color of the NHS you saw on the earlier screen, and it was featured on signs and placards, but also captured in just the hospital scrubs that the NHS staff wore. So these were the kind of images that were on display. They didn't make the experience of solidarity national, but they did help subtly invoke and reinforce pre-existing national imaginaries. So this is, think of Billig's limp flags here. They're not the kind of, it's not the flag waving thing. It's more just kind of the backdrop that subtly concocts a world of nations without us really taking note of it in some explicit sense. So that's the beginning. Add to this idea of ritual chains that help explain how discrete local rituals spread across nationally circumscribed time and space. And again, while the immediate experience of clapping was limited to the neighbors that we could see up and down the street, this kind of tangible experience, clappers could still be confident that, you know, if the road had a bend in it, that there were still clappers around the bend and or into the next street and into the next town and throughout the country. So they could be confident that their clapping continued beyond their view, connecting them ultimately, and again implicitly, in some imagined national chain of clapping. So the media here play a really important role in this because they connect the dots of these discrete local events with text and imagery from some national elsewhere, and often unidentifiable, but still something that's in our nation. And so you get this kind of a national canvas for the experience of clapping through these ritual chains. Finally, I bring in Sinisha's idea about the organizational capacity of states. And the argument here, like he was talking about in his paper, is that national imaginaries, in my case, are reproduced and channeled through institutions of state. And here, what's different, I think, is that the institutions I'm talking about that were exercised by COVID had nothing kind of intrinsically national about them. They weren't, the pandemic itself was not a kind of national event or anything like that. But the responses, the state responses to the pandemic produced national effects. So we get institutions of public health penetrating people's lives with mask mandates and booster jobs, lockdowns, and social distancing. And of course, the shared experience of mask mandates and booster jobs, lockdowns, and social distancing, which all take shape within the administrative confines of the state. And our experience of those things, our national experience of those things, are going to be different from your national experience of very similar things. And that's how clapping rituals, caged by and channeled through the institutions of state, evoked banal national imaginaries. Oh, sorry, I just skipped through all my slides. You're going to have to kind of look at that later. So put it all together, clapping becomes this kind of national genuflection when performed on a national canvas as channeled through the institutions of state and media. As a national ritual, clapping was ultimately a failure. It did not produce national solidarities. But as a failed national ritual, it did leave behind this residue of a national imaginary, a taken for granted framework for making sense of the pandemic and a national kind of sense of the pandemic. Local solidarities that got their start in clapping ceremonies were eventually rescaled and reconstituted as national imaginaries as they worked their way through the institutional machinery of the state. And this did not make clapping national, but it did filter clapping, like so many other pandemic experiences, through a national framework that was provided by the state. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, John. And we move on, last but by no means least, to Hizky Shoham, and then we're going to go to Q&A. So do start formulating your questions, and whichever platform you're watching us on, just put it in the chat there. Hizky, we'll hand over to you.
Thanks, David. So maybe it's good to be the last one. I hope you still have some patience.
Hizky, so you're coming through very quietly. Are you able to turn your microphone up a bit, please?
I'll try. Now, is it better? Sorry about that. So my question was, so thank you, everyone. It's great to have you, to be with you tonight, and it's great to publish in NNN. It's something I aspired to do long ago.
Sorry, I'm really sorry. You've gone really quiet again. I can't. I don't know if other people are having the same issue, but I can't.
I'll get closer.
Thank you.
I have no presentation. My question was, how does solidarity work through sameness? And I think that in the current era, most of us, not only as scholars but also as citizens, are very troubled by the question how or whether solidarity can transcend differences, but it doesn't mean. But it doesn't mean the sameness guarantees solidarity, and I don't think that we should assume that sameness, or that the fact that people are similar to each other, can work automatically to create groups. So nationalism is my case study, but the question is valid to all forms of groupness. So my theoretical mechanisms were basically three. First, that sameness is not a human given or an identity or a group quality. Sameness is a social performance. When we are similar to each other, it's something that is performed. And we have to find the mechanisms through which it is performed. The second theoretical mechanism is that the question, what does this performance create? So I use Danny's paradigm shift. I'm trying to move from studying identity to studying solidarity. In this case, or for a matter, studying this, the way I would say, this circling of groups. Like in the national identity paradigm, we assume that the group exists out there, and we try to measure whether or not, or to what extent people identify with it. And in the solidarity paradigm, we study networks of groups, and so we assume, or I would assume, that the nation does not exist out there, and people, for people to more or less identify, but it exists when it is performed. And the third mechanism, kind of outrageous maybe, is rehabilitating Durkheim's, I think, underused concept of mechanical solidarity. And I would say, within brackets, that I think that it's too bad that we never read the classics. When I read the Division of Labor in Society, I discovered that the stereotype that, mechanical solidarity belongs only to the so-called primitive society is simply untrue. It's not what he says. And what he says is that modern society, that he does say that so-called primitive society operates within mechanical solidarity, But he also said, and there's some stereotypical comments by Durkheim about this kind of society, but he also says that so-called modern society operates with both categories of solidarity. So, and I would say that, for example, the elementary forms of religious life and some of the other important writings by Durkheim actually express or develop the notion of mechanical solidarity. It is based on similarity that is expressed in common symbols and rituals. My method was, studying performances of similarity. I chose as an arena performances of natural customs that are related to food. I could as well, choose sports, tourism, friendships, memorials, social rituals, everything that all my friends here studied. I chose food because it's convenient. It continued my previous research about the Israeli barbecue. But basically what I did was to read a lot of secondary literature about food and nationalism. And, my family was very curious because I live in a family where we all love food very much. We love talking about it. We love eating it. We love making it. But I'm the only one in the family who doesn't love watching TV shows about food. And they all love it. And I don't like, I love talking about food and eating it, but I don't love when people talk about food and eating it and they don't invite me to eat. So I just hate watching it on TV. And my family, and they saw the books I had about this and that food, and suddenly appreciated me a little more. But what I saw that I was trying to understand what are the historical mechanisms where food through which food becomes national, and what I discovered that the mechanical solidarity has actually two concepts that can be exemplified through food. One of them is that when we all eat the same thing and feel that in some way it is national, whatever that means, it doesn't have necessarily to be like very symbolically loaded. Sometimes it's just something that we eat. We eat because we like it, and it's available in our country. So I was trying to argue that there are two basic notions about mechanical solidarity. One of them is conformist subjectivity, things that we do just like that. They don't have like deep meaning. If you ask people, like Americans why they do barbecue on 4th of July, they would say, I don't know, I just like it. It's just, kind of a leisure culture, a local leisure culture. It is not necessarily very symbolically loaded. And the other element is what I call horizontal unanimity, which means that there is some narrow motif that is the same everywhere. And when it is the same everywhere, its historicity is concealed. It's hidden. Usually, the kind of the Roman spaghetti, for example, was invented in Rome, but it is considered to be today like an Italian dish. But the history, the way it is when it was invented in a certain place, or the Italian espresso, or the English tea, etc., etc. Some of them, sometimes they were imported. Sometimes they were like the product of colonialism, or product of settler nationalism, and so on. But this kind of history is hidden, and people, again, they do it because they like it. And I was trying to argue, like Danny said at the beginning, that the nation is something that you do, is not something that you are. And I think that's a basic element in the way national solidarity is produced. I'm going to finish with so what. And my so what is that modern nationalism, I think, and we can agree easily that it's still the most significant socio-political principle of our era. And for me, it's something I'm trying to, it's part of a bigger project, which I'm not sure where it goes yet. What I'm trying to show is that the so-called modern societies are not always complex. And that I'm trying to like overturn the stereotype that is based on among other things, on that distinction by Durkheim. Sometimes our societies are simple. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I'm going to take us. Oh, actually, we've got the video clip to show, haven't we?
I'm afraid we'll have to skip the video because I have so much technical problems. I'm afraid it's going to.
Okay. Well, we'll share it later on our social media. We've got a couple of extra Hizky Shohams in the chat. Don't worry, that's just a technical thing. We're not being spied on by an army of Hizkys. So a huge amount there. Food, clapping, fun, protest, the military, sports. If people have got questions, do please put them in the chat. And I'm going to do the thing at the end. We are a little bit tight on time of asking the panelists if they've got questions for other panelists. But we've got a question straight away from Stephen for Daniel Lainer-Vos, asking if there's also a connection between nationalism and hooliganism in terms of sport.
I don't know. It's a little odd for me to answer, like in the sense that obviously sometimes, like, hooligans adorn themselves with flags and use these tools. So probably yes, but I don't think that I have anything particularly interesting to add to this kind of obvious association that they themselves do.
Thank you. And a question has come through for Siniša, asking, is there a difference in your research between the sort of the reactions or to national sentiment from soldiers in the front line and soldiers in the rear line?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, a lot of studies on behavior of soldiers do make a difference between recruits and, seasoned combatants. And recruits obviously tend to be much more influenced by the kind of civilian discourse that is mostly nationalism, and some of them are motivated to join by this, depending on context, depending on wars, while seasoned soldiers don't do that. I mean, in a sense, they often make that point as soon as you join as a recruit and come up with this nationalist rhetoric. They kind of they despise everything, and they keep these soldiers, under check. So there is that difference. There is a difference within the armies themselves between people who had a combat experience and those many soldiers who work in logistics and cooks and all sorts of other roles. So I haven't done much research myself. I did interview most of my the combatants that I interviewed had a really extensive combat experience, because that was my focus. My focus really was on combat, not the armies as such. But from other research, that there is obviously much stronger, a stronger sense of nationalist or patriotic rhetoric displayed by people who didn't have combat experience. So that's combat does change people completely. So in a sense, it's the micro bonding becomes much more intense, and it also it purifies social relations in a way that because nationhood is something abstract, and you cannot bring that into the relationship between people who have built bonds that are so strong, because that's seen as fake. You're trying to bypass or use something that is meant to be pure. I mean, from the point of view to combatants, let's say. So yes, there is a difference. Yeah.
So I suppose that it's the to take the classic thing of the imagined community, the bonds you form in combat are very much not imagined.
Yes, that's a good point. It is a non-imagined community. It is a real community, very tangible community, very physical, very interpersonal community. And the point is, when that community becomes used or translated into nationalist narrative. So what I'm trying to show in this paper is especially in the second part of the paper, how even soldiers themselves go along eventually with this after the war. After you become a part of veteran organizations, you become part of this civilian rhetoric, but you're outside the war, you're outside the battlefield, you are now a civilian. So your discourse is a civilian discourse, and you have this military capital of being somebody who fought in a war that can benefit you. So there's the Bourdieusian element here, that we as human beings will use these capitals eventually. The context changes. So even your own reflection on what happened might change.
Brilliant. Thank you. I've got John. I wanted to ask about clapping, and for people who know me, I'm slightly obsessed with Eurovision, because the Italian entry a few years ago was one called Fai Rumore, or there's noise, or they're making noise, which was I think a reference to that, and also the silence of the streets during COVID. But one of the sort of question that came to mind is the clapping was going on, but everything, because we were all locked in our houses watching the television, and what we saw on the television was our national leaders. Does the fact that all of the, so you had that local response, but all of the responses seem to be national responses, and was being understood in that national context. You had the re-emergence of borders in Europe, and sort of the competition for vaccines and so on. Does that factor into it, do you think, or does that local thing sit aside?
Well, I think that's what I'm trying to explain. I think the way you put it, David, is the way I'm thinking about it. So there's a local experience of clapping, and that's tangible, that's concrete. That's what Siniša was just talking about too, and a kind of face to face, not the imagined community, but a real community, and that I said was based on kind of helping others and whatnot. But the media gives us a kind of national frame of mind for understanding that, because it's presenting these images that are sort of, there's not a single image of clapping that kind of gives us the totality of clapping, right? So it's not everybody in a football stadium for a World Cup match, or something that allows us to see the kind of imagined community of the nation. So what we have are these sorts of, these dots of clapping, these like representative pictures of clapping, and I think that's the thing, that it doesn't make us think that we're clapping as a nation, but it puts that idea in our head in some sort of way, and that's why I try to kind of lower the bar from solidarity to this idea of just a national imaginary. I guess the point is that COVID, isn't intrinsically national. It doesn't have anything to do with that. But the way states responded to it, the way states were exercised by the pandemic and had to develop their own responses to it, gave national kind of dimensions to our experiences of it, which is why our experiences of very similar things in different countries nevertheless varied on a kind of national scale. So I think there is a connection, yeah.
Thank you. We've probably got just about 5 or 6 minutes left. So if there's any more questions from the audience, do please put them in the chat wherever you are. I'm just going to ask, do any of the panelists want to ask questions of the other panelists? I think I see a hand up there. Daniel. Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry.
Oh, that's all right.
Sorry. I don't have a specific question, but I feel that the question I received earlier, I was a little bit, I provided a very unsatisfying answer. So I want to try again, if it's okay. In the case that I studied, this specific league organizers in New York, like there were instances of hooliganism. For the organizer, it was highly disturbing and problematic. They were a small kind of diaspora group with a problematic reputation. So they did all they can to suppress it and eventually managed to suppress it somehow. I suspect that a lot of the hooliganism that happened in the field that I studied had more to do with alcohol consumption than nationalism. Simply the events themselves were also, a business, and they sold alcohol, and it reduces inhibitions. In other instances, you can see hooliganism kind of that has this national flair to it. My sense is that alcohol has something to do with that too, and that's all.
Just for Lea, I have a question on. It would be interesting to see, and I don't know whether you study that outside of your paper and your book, on how other ideologies relate to these symbols like shoe. Is there some equivalent of a shoe for socialists, for some religious ideologies, for anarchists? What would be alternative kind of objects that could perform that role outside of nationalism?
There are many different objects that are used as a prop in protests, and some manage to elevate and to become symbols, and some are just props. When you have chains are, for example, used in many protests that had to do something with the ecology, so protecting trees, you chain yourself to something. Suitcases, for example, are also being used. Keys are also very prominent symbols. But the thing is, you can link different objects and props to different types of ideologies. So although they have some initial meaning, actually the context, and I didn't talk about it, is where do you place them and how do you place them is very important for that. How do you set the tone? What is the agenda? What is the ideology? I mean, I have a part of it also in this article, but more in the book, how even shoes, that have this meaning, locked meaning of void and death and destruction, are used for green movements and how we are going to, environmental change and climate change, and they're very much linked into human rights. So how you're going to actually tie them into ideology, it has to do with several other factors, not only what is the meaning of the object. Yeah, exactly.
I'd just like to thank everybody for joining us on this project. Again, it was long going, but it seems like we made it to this final product, and I hope these kind of questions will go on. Putting solidarity and the focus, which again is not the focus of many of the studies of nationhood. And each of us had a different, question and project they're doing, and also hope we could be in touch and maybe do something similar someday. And so thank you very much.
Thank you, Danny.
Yeah, thank you,
Thanks, Danny.
Thank David as well.
Well, no, I was going to say thank Danny as well, because I emailed Danny and said, "Oh, this is really interesting. Do you fancy doing an event?" And then I got an email back later that said, "Yeah, okay. Here's the details." So this was the easiest event I've ever organised. So thank you. Thank you all to Danny Kaplan, Siniša Malešević, Lea David, Daniel Lainer-Vos, John Fox and Hizky Shoham. All of the articles in the theme section are out in the current issue of Nations and Nationalism. volume 31, issue 1, available now online. Just Google Nations and Nationalism. If you subscribe to the print copy, that is, I think, literally in the post at the moment, so should be landing on your doormats very soon. I'll just wrap up by reminding you that our next event is on the 18th of February with Timo Arva on non-territorial autonomy in the Baltic states in the first part of the 20th century. And if you are interested in applying for the Anthony D. Smith Visiting Fellowship, which is what Timo is doing at the moment, applications are open for a few more days on our website at asen.ac.uk. Thank you all very much for joining us, and we will see you all at the next event. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Nice. Good evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.